Imagine the scene. It is the afternoon of January 20th, 1953. In front of the Capitol building, the bands are playing, the cannons are firing, and the crowds are roaring for the new Caesar, Dwight D. Eisenhower. The air is electric with the promise of a new era. The world is watching the transfer of ultimate power, a spectacle of democracy that is broadcast across the globe. But if you turn the camera away from the pomp and circumstance, away from the cheering masses and the waving flags, and zoom in on the gloomy, wind-swept platform of Union Station, you will see a very different picture, a picture that history books often forget to paint. There, standing on the cold concrete, is an old man in a simple overcoat, shivering in the biting winter wind. He is holding a single, battered suitcase. His knuckles are white from the cold, or perhaps from the grip of anxiety. There are no Secret Service agents forming a human shield around him, scanning the rooftops for snipers. There is no motorcade waiting with engines running, ready to whisk him away to safety. There are no reporters fighting for a quote, no flashbulbs popping. Just a few hours ago, this man held the power to vaporize cities with a single phone call. He commanded millions of soldiers across the globe. He was the architect of NATO, the man who stared down Stalin, the most powerful human being on the face of the earth. Now, he is just Harry. He stands in line to buy his own train ticket to Missouri. He carries his own bag, refusing help from the porters he can no longer afford. The passengers walking by barely glance at him, wrapped in their own lives, not realizing that the quiet old man sitting in the corner seat, staring out the window at the gray sky, once redrew the map of the world. This isn't just a departure. It is a plummet from the summit of Olympus to the hard pavement of reality. The silence around him is deafening. It screams of how quickly power evaporates when the title is stripped away. But in that lonely figure, standing on the platform, there is a profound mystery. Why is the man who rebuilt Europe with the Marshall Plan, who launched the atomic age, and who fought the Cold War, leaving the capital of the world like a refugee? Why does he look not like a king retiring to his palace, but like a man fleeing a crime scene with his last possessions? The answer lies inside that single suitcase and the dark financial secret it concealed from the American public, a secret that was about to turn his life into a struggle for survival. To understand why Harry Truman stood on that platform, looking more like a pauper than a president, you have to strip away the myth and look at the math. You have to open the president's wallet, and what you find inside is shocking. It was empty. Truman kept a secret from the world for 8 long years. The leader of the free world was broke. Not just short on cash in the way rich people complain about liquidity, but deeply, humiliatingly, dangerously in debt. When he was signing executive orders that moved fleets across oceans and authorized billions of dollars to save starving nations in Europe, he was personally counting pennies at his kitchen table to see if he could afford stamps for his private letters to his mother. The truth was that the presidency had not enriched him, it had bankrupted him. Before he entered the White House, Truman was still paying off the crushing debts from his failed haberdashery business in the 1920s. He wasn't a Rockefeller born into oil money or a Kennedy born into banking wealth. He was a farmer's son who had never made a fortune, a man who knew the taste of failure. When he became president, his salary was $100,000 a year. To the average American, that sounded like a king's ransom. But the hidden reality of the White House was a financial trap. The expenses of the office were astronomical, And in those days, most of them were unpaid by the state. Truman had to pay for the servants' food out of his own pocket. He had to cover the costs of state dinners that weren't strictly official. He paid for the travel of his staff. Every time he hosted a guest, every time he threw a party, it drained his personal account. By the time he left office in 1953, he had exhausted his meager savings. He had burned through everything. And here is the kicker. He had no pension. In 1953, there was no retirement fund for former presidents. The moment Eisenhower took the oath, Truman's salary stopped.
Zero. He knew that the moment he stepped off that train in Missouri, he had no income, no job, and a mountain of debt waiting for him. The suitcase wasn't light because he was a minimalist. It was light because he literally couldn't afford to bring anything else. He was returning to a modest white Victorian house in Independence that didn't even belong to him. It belonged to his mother-in-law. He had no idea how he would pay the electric bill next month. The man who had faced down the Red Army and stared into the nuclear abyss was now terrified of something much more mundane and relentless. He was terrified of the mailman bringing the bills he couldn't pay. But the tragedy of Truman's poverty was a choice, a brutal, agonizing, deliberate choice. As soon as he arrived in Independence, the vultures began to circle. Corporate America knew that Truman was desperate. They knew he had no money, and they smelled blood in the water. Offers began to flood his mailbox, tempting him with salvation. Big corporations, powerful lobbying firms, and luxury clothing brands offered him positions on their boards. They offered him honorary titles where he would do no work but receive six-figure salaries. One company offered him a $100,000 contract, equivalent to $1 million today, just to sign his name on their stationery. Another offered him a fortune to appear in a commercial for a new car. All he had to do was say yes. All he had to do was sell the prestige of the presidency for a paycheck. It would have solved all his problems instantly. He could have lived in luxury, renovated his drafty house, and secured his family's future for generations. The temptation must have been overwhelming. He was an old man with nothing, staring at a check that could fix everything. But Harry Truman did something that seems impossible, almost alien, in our modern world of celebrity politicians and book deals. He said no. He turned down every single offer. He sat in his cluttered study, wearing an old cardigan, eating canned soup, and wrote polite but firm rejection letters to millionaires. He famously stated that he would never lend himself to any transaction, however respectable, that would commercialize the prestige of the presidency. He believed the office belonged to the people, not to him. He refused to turn the title of commander-in-chief into a marketing gimmick for soap or cars. This wasn't just stubbornness, it was a form of secular martyrdom. He chose poverty over dishonor. He chose to struggle rather than to sell out. It was a quiet, private war he fought within the walls of his home, battling the temptation to cash in while watching his bank account dwindle to nothing. He proved that while they could take his office, they couldn't buy his soul. The summer of 1953 brought a new kind of madness to Truman's post-presidency. Bored, restless, and feeling the walls closing in, Truman decided to do something that would be considered suicidal today. He decided to take a road trip. Just him and his wife Bess. No Secret Service agents, no police escort, no armored vehicles, no bodyguards. He loaded up his Chrysler New Yorker, a car he had bought himself, put on his hat, and just drove out of the driveway. Imagine the sheer insanity of the scene. The man who had ordered the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the man who had launched the Korean War, the man who had mortal enemies in Moscow and Beijing who would have paid millions for his head, was driving down Route 66 like a retired tourist looking for a diner. He stopped at roadside cafes for sandwiches. He stayed in cheap motels where the doors barely locked. He pumped his own gas. At one point, a police officer pulled him over for driving too slow in the left lane, creating a traffic hazard. The officer nearly fainted when he walked up to the window, expecting an old farmer, and saw the former President of the United States grinning back at him. But beneath the adventure and the folksy charm, there was a terrifying reality. Truman was completely vulnerable. Any lunatic with a gun, any Soviet agent, any angry political rival could have walked up to his car at a stoplight and ended him. He carried no weapon. He had no backup. It was a reckless, defiant act of freedom from a man who had been a prisoner of the White House bubble for 8 years. But it also highlighted how completely the government had abandoned him. They had taken his power, used his leadership to save the world, and then threw him out into the wild without a shred of protection. It was a miracle he survived that trip without incident. But for Truman, the danger of the open road was better than the slow death of irrelevance and bankruptcy and independence. He was running away from the silence of his empty house.
By 1957, the secret of Truman's financial ruin could no longer be hidden. It was becoming a national embarrassment, whispered about in the corridors of Congress. The former president was selling off pieces of his family farmland just to keep the lights on and pay property taxes. He was spending his remaining energy writing his memoirs, working late into the night, not for fame or ego, but because he desperately needed the advance money from the publisher to pay off his accumulating debts. It was a race against time and bankruptcy, a humiliating hustle for a man of his stature. The situation became so dire that it finally shamed Congress into action. They looked at Harry Truman and realized the optics were disastrous. The United States, the richest country on earth, was about to let one of its greatest leaders die in the poorhouse. It was a scandal waiting to explode on the front pages of newspapers worldwide. So, in 1958, Congress passed the Former President's Act. It wasn't a generic law created for abstract reasons. It was written specifically to save Harry Truman from destitution. It granted a pension of $25,000 a year to former presidents. It was a lifeline, thrown at the last possible second. When the news reached independence, Truman didn't celebrate. He didn't gloat. He simply accepted it with the quiet relief of a drowning man catching a rope. It is a supreme irony that the only other living former president at the time, Herbert Hoover, was a multimillionaire who didn't need the money at all. Yet Hoover accepted the pension too. Why? He stated that he took it only so as not to embarrass Truman. If Hoover had refused it, it would have highlighted Truman's poverty even more. It was the final humiliation. Truman had to be saved by charity from the very government he had once led. The man who had rebuilt the economies of Europe and Japan couldn't even secure his own retirement without an emergency act of Congress. When Harry Truman finally died in December 1972, he left the world as he had entered it, without a fortune. He left no vast real estate empire. He left no foundation worth billions. He left no board seats or stock portfolios. The inventory of his estate was shockingly modest for a man who had held the fate of the world in his hands. But he left something else. He left a lesson in that battered suitcase he carried that day at Union Station. That suitcase didn't contain gold bars, insider stock tips, or secret contracts with defense contractors. It contained the clothes of a man who knew exactly who he was. Truman understood something that modern leaders have seemingly forgotten. He understood that the presidency is a rental, not an ownership. He believed that public service was a duty, not a business opportunity. He treated the White House like a public trust, and when his time was up, he returned the keys, swept the floor, and walked away with his hands clean. In an era of rampant corruption, where politicians leave office as multi-millionaires and leverage their connections for profit, the image of Harry Truman standing on that cold platform with a single suitcase is not an image of defeat. It is an image of ultimate victory. He beat the system by refusing to play its game. He proved that you can hold the world in your hands and put it down without any of it sticking to your fingers. That heavy suitcase was actually light, lighter than any of us can imagine, because it carried no guilt, no compromise, and no sold-out secrets. It was the baggage of the last honest man in Washington. And as he walked away into the mist of history, he didn't need a motorcade or a security detail. He walked tall, protected by the armor of his own integrity.